It's my very great pleasure today to introduce Fred Kirschenmann. We attempted to get Fred in the very first organic conference as one of our plenary speaker at the conference, and we've kind of hoped to have Fred come visit us ever since. I recently watched online one of the TED Talks, and Fred was giving a talk. It was called Soils, Dirt to Lifeline, and he said that biologically healthy soils are our lifeline to the future. I think this is the kind of person we need to talk with. And on that TED Talk, he introduced himself as a farmer, which he is, but there are many, many other things which he is. And I won't give you the whole list because that would take us more time. But a distinguished fellow for the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, president of Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture in New York, professor of religion and philosophy. He's got a doctorate in philosophy that actually is in philosophy. That's really rare. And a whole list of things. And yet he introduced himself as a farmer, and I think that's an indication of the esteem in which some of us hold farmers. And I think that's an important thing for us to realize, that farmers are where the crop comes from. And this is a speaker who believes that, and I think this is important. He also has a farm which he's still part of in North Dakota, so experience which is relevant to us here. He's got a book, Cultivating an Ecological Conscience, Essays from a Farmer Philosopher. And we have been hoping to have him come speak to us for many years. So it's my really great pleasure to introduce him at this time. Dr. Fred Kirschenmann.
Well, thank you very much. I don't get most of the word as much as I'd like to, but every time I do, I have a great time. And the energy in this room is an indication that it's going to be another one of those times. And I'm going to, the topic that I've been given is designing a resilient agriculture for a changing world. And I think that one of the things that all of us on our planet now have not yet fully taken into consideration is the kind of changes that we're going to be seeing coming at us in the decades ahead. And having a realistic perspective on that, I think, is one of the most important things that's facing the current generation of us who are occupying the planet, particularly if we're interested in the kind of future that our children and our grandchildren will have. And when those of us who are involved in agriculture and food systems, who have a responsibility for food security and water security for our future generations, have a particular responsibility in this. And so what I want to do this morning, and I'm going to try to do this in a relatively short period of time, given the nature of the topic. I'm going to have an hour and a half this afternoon, and I'm going to suggest that we also take some of that time for those of you who want to go into this more deeply, because I'm not going to have time to cover everything in the talk this morning. So what I want to do is to help us understand the larger picture of some kind of issues we're going to be dealing with. And the word resilience here is particularly important to me. I've been involved in sustainable agriculture for over 40 years now. And it became clear to me already about 5 years ago that when we're talking about sustainability, we're not just talking about making things a little less bad and trying to improve the current system a little bit. We're really talking about how we can have an agriculture and food system that can really absorb the shocks and disturbances that we're going to see and still perform the function of providing food security and water security that we're all going to need as a human population. And so this word resilience is one that, unfortunately, the good news is that over the last 2 years now, it is starting to come into the literature. I still don't think that most of us have, as I said, have looked at what all of that means in terms of how we're going to do agriculture on the land. And those of us who are farmers, of course, have to particularly look at this. So one of the things that has helped me to understand how this world that we're going to be living in the future is going to be different from what we've all gotten used to in the past, is to put it into the frame of history. And if we start to think about this in terms of how we fed ourselves as human beings since we've been on the planet. And fortunately, we have an anthropologist by the name of Ernest Chusky, who published a book about this about 2 decades ago, by the name of Ernest Chusky. And as an anthropologist, as you would expect, he looks at this in terms of how have we fed ourselves over the long time that we've been on the planet. And so here's the picture that he paints. And here's where, I don't use PowerPoint anymore because it just, it takes too much time to put it all together and everything. But here's a place where PowerPoint would actually be useful. But we all got imaginations, right? So I'm going to have you imagine that on the screen there's a timeline of human history all the way across the screen, right? Okay, got that picture in mind? So about 2/3 of the way across that screen is how we originally fed ourselves on the planet. And that was as hunter-gatherers. So what we did is we lived in small bands, very much like herds of deer and herds of bison, etc. And we'd go out into nature and we'd gather and hunt what we needed to feed ourselves. So we would, harvest root crops, we would hunt root plants, we would harvest seed plants, we would hunt animals, and then we'd hunt out a place, and then we'd move on to another place, just like other creatures do. And that's how we fed ourselves. And Ernest Chusky makes an interesting point of view. He says that from an energy efficiency perspective, that was the most efficient food system we ever had. And of course, if you think about it, it just makes common sense, right? I mean, we didn't do any cultivating, we didn't domesticate plants and animals, we didn't put all of that energy into the food system. We simply went out and gathered it and prepared it and ate it. And he calculates that we were getting about 20 kilocalories of food energy for every 1 kilocalorie of energy that we invested in making that available. And then about 10 or 11,000 years ago, so now you come another third way across about an eighth way across the screen on your imaginary line over here, we introduced agriculture. And he raises an interesting question because now in doing agriculture, you've got all this other energy that you have to invest in producing the food. You now have to cultivate, you have to domesticate plants and animals, etc. Everything that we've done in agriculture. And we cut our energy efficiency about in half. So now we were only getting about 10 kilocalories of food for every kilocalorie of energy we invested in making that food available. So why would we do that? And apparently anthropologists haven't come to an agreement yet as to why we would do that. I think the rationale, which makes the most sense to me, is that our human populations had grown to a point where we couldn't just hunt out a place and then move on to the next place. We had to start living in settled societies. And when you live in a settled society, you've got to produce enough food where you are to keep the population fed during the whole time that you're there. So now we were into this agriculture area, which we call the Neolithic period, right? 10 or 11,000 years. And during that whole period of time, we were using primarily animal energy and human energy in order to make our food security available to us. And then Chusky argues, and here's the really interesting part. He argues that about the early part of the 20th century, in the 1930s, we entered a third era. So now you've got the hunter-gatherer era, you've got the Neolithic era, and now comes the third era, which he calls, and I love this term, the neo-caloric era. And it's the neo-caloric era because it's entirely based on over calories. And he says that this era, now again, you think about this timeline going across the screen, this era will of necessity be a very short period of time, probably at the most about 2 centuries, and we're about halfway into that now. And so then he asks an important question, and that is, and now you take the rest of this timeline across the screen with a big question mark over it, and that question is, what is the next era of food production going to be for the human species? And that's the question which all of us here today have to address. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this neo-caloric era, it is now the least efficient food system from an energy efficient point of view. We have now reversed it. It now takes us about 10 kilocalories of energy to produce a single kilocalorie of food. And that gives you an idea of how dependent we are on these old calories to produce all of the food and make the water available to sustain our human population. Now, what are these old calories? And this is where I'm going to do really quick, because you all know what this is all about anyway, and we can discuss it more this afternoon if you want to know more details. One of those old calories, of course, is fossil fuels. And fossil fuels is what has driven everything in this neocaloric era agriculture. If you think about, I look at my own farm, and I'm an organic farmer, right? And so we always like to pride ourselves in that we're not as energy dependent as our neighbors are, but we're still using a hell of a lot of fossil fuels. We use fossil fuels for our equipment. The equipment is made from fossil fuels to come up with the iron ore, copper, and everything else that goes into making that equipment. We use the fossil fuels for whatever kinds of inputs, even if they aren't synthetic ones that we're bringing into our operations. Everything. And the production of the crops that we produce, transporting it to the places where it has to go to become processed into food, it's all based, whether it's organic or non-organic, it's still based on fossil fuels. Now, to our credit, we use a lot less fossil fuels per unit of food than our conventional farming neighbors do, but we're still using a lot of fossil fuels. So this is one of the old calories, and it's not a question of exactly when we run out of oil, or when we run out of natural gas, or when we run out of coal. It's when it's no longer going to be affordable. Because the era of cheap energy is over, and it's been cheap energy which has supported this neocaloric era food system that we've all become so dependent on. One of the other old calories that we've been very much dependent upon, and here as organic farmers we have an advantage, and that's the minerals, especially rock phosphate and potash, which of course are critical next to nitrogen in terms of producing our food. We are depleting all of our mineral resources all across the planet. There now are only 4 countries that still have rock phosphate reserves, only 4 countries that still have potash reserves. And the reason that fertilizer prices are going up so badly is one of the reasons, of course, is the energy cost to produce it going up. The other reason is because the amount of fertilizers that are still available out there are becoming depleted, and so prices are going up, and they will continue to go up. The third part of the old calories is fresh water. And we have been using our fresh water at an unprecedented rate just for our food and agriculture system. 70% of our fresh water on this planet now are used just for agricultural irrigation. And one of the reasons that we're using so much fresh water is because in this neocaloric system, we have not paid attention to restoring the biological health of soils, so our soil doesn't absorb and retain as much water, so we've got to have more irrigation. And then with one of the other things we'll talk about a little bit is climate. With climate change and more droughts, etc., we need more water. Now, just as one example of this, and this is, you can have examples all across the country, and I don't have time to go into that, but just one example is the Ogallala Aquifer, which is the major source of irrigation water in the central part of the United States, which irrigates crops in parts of South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas. It's a major source of irrigation water that produces a major amount of our crops in that whole central part of the United States. We have drawn down the Ogallala aquifers by half since 1960. And according to an article in Harper's Magazine in July of 2012, this year, there was an article called The Broken Heartland. And the article pointed out that in addition to having drawn it down by half since 1960, we are still today drawing it down at the rate of 6 to 8 feet a year. And they are projecting that by 20 years from now, the Ogallala Aquifer will no longer have water available for irrigation and agriculture. And the reason they call it the Broken Heartland, because that means that whole central part of the United States, we will no longer be able to grow crops because there's not going to be water for irrigation, because irrigation is essential to producing crops in that area. So they're saying, what happens then, it finally turns into a kind of Buffalo Commons, right? Well, maybe we could plant it into grass and raise some animals, but it's not going to be